Anyone else struggle with too many emails? I feel like based on what we just heard, like that's a really minor thing and also simultaneously like a very 2011 problem. But my inbox is constantly full. Like particularly because I love reading about like personal devotional stuff and church stuff and leadership stuff, and so I'm constantly like looking at blogs and watching videos and things, and it seems like everyone has an opportunity at some point to sign up for their monthly or weekly or Lord help me daily email newsletter, and I'm like all in anytime I see those things because I'll see someone and their content or read what they got going on. I'm like, I want to learn more about this. And so I will subscribe to their email. And then like a week will go by and all of a sudden my inbox is just flooded, right? Like it just absolutely full of emails, and it becomes wildly unmanageable very quickly. And so I have developed a habit that has been incredibly helpful. At least once a month, I go through and I look through, okay, what are the emails that I'm just never getting to read, or I'm just archiving without having read them, or I just haven't been learning a whole lot from that particular person. And when it comes to all of those emails, I found a button that is my new best friend. If you scroll to the bottom of mass chain emails, eventually you'll find a button that says unsubscribe. Right? Unsubscribe. And you click that button and they'll stop sending you emails. It's incredible. Like it's done. And that doesn't mean that the email was bad. Often these are things that there was really, really good stuff. I just don't have the capacity to continue to do this. It doesn't even mean that I'm saying no forever. It may just be for a while that I need a break. But eventually, if you scroll down, you can find that button, unsubscribe. I think some of us, in some areas of our lives, need to hit the unsubscribe button. That many of us might feel like our lives are full and full to the brim, that they're filled with good things. And just like those emails, it may have been like little good things that accumulate over time until it becomes unmanageable. And maybe it's time to hit unsubscribe. It's time to lay some things down, to say no to some things so we can focus on what's most important. So we can be intentional and not just let life happen to us. So my goal this morning is to begin a conversation where we unsubscribe from some things so that we can stay connected to the most important things. And so we're kicking off this series this week, Unsubscribe, Giving Up What's Holding You Down. And this series is loosely coinciding with Lent. If you're unfamiliar with Lent, Lent is the 40 days leading up to Easter, not including Sunday, that starts with Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday was a little over a week ago. That's why I say it's loosely coinciding with Lent. And historically through the Lent, because in the modern day, like Lent is, you may view it as primarily like a Catholic thing or a Lutheran thing, but Lent has been a historic practice in Christianity for well over 1,000 years. And historically during Lent, people are encouraged to give something up, to abstain from a particular thing or a particular practice for that 40 days in preparation for Easter. And so maybe you're giving up a certain kind of food, right? Things that are common, or especially today, giving up sugar or giving up pop or giving up meat. More recently, it could be things like giving up social media, giving up video games, giving up watching TV or time on your phone. But regardless of what's given up, Lent is supposed to be a time of increased intentionality. A season where we give up some things so that we can be more focused on the things that matter. So throughout this series, we're going to be looking at different things that we can give up, whether it be for a day or for a season. Things like food and technology and busyness. And as I start this series, I want to begin by laying a foundation by asking the question, Why? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Maybe you're familiar with the practice of giving up things for Lent, but why do we do it? If we're going to spend a few weeks talking about how we should abstain from certain things, how we should stop doing certain things, why do we give these things up to begin with? So to answer that, we're going to be in Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 23. I'd encourage you to turn there. The text will be on the screen as it normally is, but you'll have a minute to turn to Luke chapter 9 because I want to set us up really quickly with where we're at in the story. So a little before this, Jesus had drawn in a big crowd with his teaching, as he'd often done. There were over 5,000 people who were listening to him speak, and it had been a while, and they were starting to get hungry. And so Jesus says, hey, let's give them something to eat. Well, they don't really have much food around. They have some bread and some fish, and yet Jesus multiplies the bread and the fish and feeds everyone. And they have baskets of food left over. They have more food left over than what they started with. It's an incredible miracle. And after this, as he often did, Jesus got alone to go be with the Father and to pray. And it's while he's kind of in a secluded area, he's away from the big crowds, he gathers together with his disciples, the 12 men who followed him most closely, and he starts asking them questions about who everyone, like what's word on the street? Who do people say that I am? And there's some decent guesses, but then he's like, who do you say, again to the disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. You are the Messiah. Now, they would have had an idea of what that meant because they had a picture in their minds of who the Messiah was going to be. The Messiah was this figure that was described in prophetic literature in the Old Testament, and they were going to be this coming heroic person. They didn't know exactly what they were going to do, but the idea they had often in their minds is that the Messiah would free Israel from the Romans. They were under Roman rule, under Roman occupation, so the idea was that this Messiah would come and he would be a political and military and spiritual leader who would establish Israel as its own sovereign nation, one that would rival Rome in greatness and in power. And on the throne of this earthly kingdom would sit the Messiah, who in Peter's mind was Jesus. Jesus would sit on this earthly throne of this earthly kingdom, replacing David as the greatest king that Israel ever had. And Jesus essentially begins gently reshaping their conception of what the Messiah will do. He says, yes, he is indeed the Messiah, but his purpose is so much grander than the overthrow of a government that won't exist in 500 years anyway. His purpose is so much grander than that. He has a different kind of kingdom in mind. And this different kind of kingdom would require a different kind of disciple, a different kind of follower. So Jesus, instead of talking about the overthrow of the Roman government, he starts talking about his death. He starts talking about his death at the hands of that very same Roman government, and that he wasn't going to be alone. This is where we dive into Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 23. Then Jesus said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. One of the things I try to talk about frequently is being a Jesus follower. And sometimes I will avoid using the word Christian because my fear is that the word Christian has at times been co-opted and a little bit diluted. Here's what I mean by that. Did you know that you can go online right now and buy Christian breath mints? That's real. You can go online and you can buy Christian breath mints. I don't know what was wrong with the secular breath mints that we decided we need special Christian breath mints, nor did I know that breath mints could give their lives to Jesus. But here we are with Christian breath mints, right? So I hear things like that, and I see how if you asked 100 different Christians what it means to be a Christian, you might get 100 different answers, and to me that's a little bit problematic. However, Christians should be Jesus followers, right? Christians should be Jesus followers. In fact, that's what the word Christian originally meant. It wasn't something that they chose for themselves. It was something given to them by people outside of the church who would look at them and say, look at you, you're all being a bunch of little Christs. In other words, you're following Jesus. That's how they got the name in the first place. And so while there may be ambiguity as to what it means to be a Christian, Jesus on multiple occasions is crystal clear about what it means to follow him. And this is one of those occasions. He says, if you want to be my follower, in other words, if you want to be a Christian, if you want to follow Jesus, give up your own way and take up your cross daily. See, to follow Jesus, you must take up your cross. Now, so far as scholars can tell, the phrase take up your cross had not been used before. It's not something that appears in writings. It's not something that appears to have been a thing that people said. It's a phrase that's unique to Jesus. However, while that phrase daily pick up your cross in the Christian context was brand new, the idea of a cross and picking up your cross would have been one that was very familiar to the people in the audience. See, the cross, while we see it as a symbol connected to Jesus, the cross was only a symbol connected to Rome and to death by torture. That's what the cross was in that day and age. See, it turns out Rome had perfected the tortured death. They would hang you on these cross beams and nails through your wrists, nails through your hands. It was a way to maximize the amount of pain and the length of time you were in pain while keeping you alive as long as they could, though eventually you would die on there. It was a horrendous way to die. Not only that, but prisoners who were about to be executed on the cross, they would be forced to walk through the streets of the town with a cross on their shoulder, dragging it through the streets. So that's what it meant to pick up your cross. It wasn't a thing that people who were God-fearing did. It was people who were about to be executed did. Picking up your cross was a symbol that you were in submission to Roman authority. So why would Jesus tell people to take up their cross? That just doesn't seem to make sense. Well, it's because he knew what he was about to endure. That he was about to physically pick up his own cross, drag it through the streets. He knew that he was going to be crucified on a cross. And not only him, but many of the people who were listening at the time, many of his disciples would also be martyred for their faith. They would also die on a cross because of their belief in Jesus. But you can't literally die on a cross every single day, right? That doesn't make sense. And so the point Jesus makes isn't a literal one so much as it is a figurative one or a metaphor. See, picking up your cross means that to follow Jesus, we die to self. To follow Jesus, we die to self. The call to pick up our cross and follow Jesus is a call to die to self. It's recognizing that self is no longer in charge. That God is in charge now. Whereas picking up your cross in their context meant that you were under the submission of the Roman government, picking up our cross in our context means that we are under submission to God. And that because of that, we're called to a change in our priorities in our lives. We're called to lay some things down and to pick other things up because we no longer belong to ourselves. We belong to God. And our lives will look very different depending on who is in charge. See, when self is in charge. When I'm in charge, I determine how my time is spent. I determine who I spend my time with. I determine how my money is spent. I determine my agenda, and I determine my priorities. But when I pick up my cross, when I die to self, when I place myself under God's authority and He's in charge, well then He determines how I spend my time. He determines who I spend my time with. He determines how I spend my money. He sets my agendas and He sets my priorities. Becoming a parent is actually a pretty good, if imperfect, metaphor for what this looks like. Before I had kids, I could do almost anything I wanted. It was a glorious time in some respects. Like, in fact, get this, I remember that before Chelsea and I had kids, we could spontaneously decide to go out to eat. It was awesome. Like, there was no planning, there was no extra budgeting, there were no car seats or sippy cups or snacks or diaper bags or crayons. Well, okay, there were crayons at the table for me, but it was so much simpler, right? But then I had kids, and when I had kids, some of that freedom that I had to lay down, right? I couldn't just do whatever I want whenever I wanted because now I have kids. We can't just go anywhere we want whenever we want because now we have kids. It's fundamentally changed my priorities. It's fundamentally changed how the responsibility that I have. Now, the good news is I feel like I've gained more than I've lost, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get back to that in a minute. The call to follow Jesus is a call to lay down my freedom, my preferences, and follow Him. I die to myself so that I live for Him. And Luke includes one word because the same story appears in Matthew and Mark as well. Luke includes one word that the others leave out. Jesus says this is something that we have to do daily. I daily pick up my cross. It's an important reminder because this doesn't come naturally to us. Self is incredibly resilient. Self doesn't want to die. It very much so wants to be in charge. So we aren't naturally going to gravitate toward letting God set our agendas and our priorities. It's something that we need to practice. We need a reminder of who is really in charge. A reminder to set aside what I want and start asking God what He wants. So let me ask you, what does picking up your cross, what does dying to self look like to you? What does it mean to do that daily? Let me give you a couple examples that might help flesh this out a bit. Maybe it's in how we spend our time. If you're like me, it can be a struggle to find the time to read the Bible and spend time in prayer. Right? Myself wants to do other things. Myself wants to play video games or read other books or watch YouTube or doom scroll on Facebook or just sleep in, right? Like that's what self wants to do. But part of picking up my cross, dying to self and submitting to Jesus is spending time with Him. Right? And saying, these are the things that I want to do with my time, but I'm not the one setting my calendar, Christ is. And so what does it look like to make sure that I'm putting into my calendar that I'm spending time with Him? I'm laying down what I want to do and picking up what He wants me to do. I know I've touched on this other one before, but maybe another area could be finances. There's a lot of things out there that I would love to buy. There are a lot of things that I want, and we have the money for it, but we've allowed God to set our priorities when it comes to finances. So for us, that looks like we're not going to go into ridiculous amounts of debt, and we are going to tithe. We're going to give 10% of everything we make back to the church. That's what it looks like for us to die to self, because self wants to buy all the shiny new toys, to die to self and instead live for Christ. and lay down my own agenda, my own priorities, and do things his way. But it's going to look a little different for each person. So what does it look like for you? What does your self need to say no to so that you can give God your yes? Because Jesus continues and he shares something that has the power to upend our worldview entirely. He continues in verse 24. If you try and hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give your life away for my sake, you will save it. So some of you might have listened to what I've been saying for the past 5-10 minutes, and you're like, I don't really want to give up my freedoms. I don't really want to give up my preferences. I don't really want to die to self. But to that, Jesus shares an interesting truth about how his kingdom works. Again, it's not a kingdom that people were anticipating or looking for. This is a different kind of kingdom that requires a different kind of follower. And Jesus is just shared a truth about how his kingdom works. He says, if you try and hang on to your life, if you try and do things my way with my own agenda and my own priorities, and I only care about self, the result of hanging on to that life will be that you lose it. And on the face of it, that doesn't really seem to make sense, right? Because if I want to save $20, I shouldn't lose my $20 bill, right? Like that doesn't really seem to make sense. And yet, I've heard too many stories not to recognize the truth in Jesus' words here. There's so many stories, too many to share, of like CEOs of major corporations or celebrities who spent their whole lives in dedication to self. Right? And it led them to the height of their career, right? They climbed that corporate ladder and they made those big deals and they brought in all kinds of money. And here they are with the most amount of respect and the most amount of money and the highest position that they've ever had in their entire lives. And then you just hear them talk about the emptiness that they experience. They get to the top of the world and it's all meaningless. Why? Because they spent so much time on self and finding self and saving self. That's the exact same thing that they lost. And that's what Jesus is getting at here. If we spend our whole lives in service to self, the result will be you'll get to the end of your life and find out that you actually lost the very thing that you were searching for. But if we'll lose our life for his sake, we'll save it. See, the opposite is also true. If we'll set self aside and do life God's way, that's actually where we'll find life. So if we'll die to self, what you'll find is that you'll gain something far greater than what you give up. And that's my main point this morning, is that when you lose something for the sake of Christ, you gain more than you lost. When you lose something for the sake of Christ, you'll gain more than you lost. It may not, now, this doesn't mean, well, I gave $100 to the church, so now I'm expecting $150 to show up in my bank account, right? That may not be how that works. It shows up in other ways. But it sounds like the opposite of how things should work. But that's exactly how Jesus' kingdom operates. And if that still sounds a little bit crazy, let me go back to parenting just for a moment. Again, not a perfect metaphor, but I just talked about the change in priorities that happens when you become a parent. And that when becoming a parent, I had to lose some freedoms and some freedom I had to do whatever I wanted to do. However, it's been totally worth it. When I think back about, because Rhett's almost 4, and when I think back over the last 4 years, some of my favorite moments, in fact, most of my favorite moments, if not all of my favorite moments, involve my kids. Like, there has been almost no greater joy than the ability to lay down my life for them. I lost something, yes, but I also gained something. And what I gained is far more than what I lost. And this is what happens when we lose something for the sake of Christ. If we're willing to lay something down for Jesus, we'll find something greater than what we laid down. So when I lay down my time, when self wants to do, sleep in and play video games and all those things, right? But I choose to lay down myself and spend that time instead in prayer and reading scripture, I'm going to find that time was far more valuable than the alternative. When I submit myself to doing finances God's way, I'm going to find a joy in giving that receiving simply cannot match. There's so much to be gained when we choose to lay down lesser things for greater things. And that's essentially the last point that Jesus wants to make here. This is verse 25. He says, "And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but are yourself lost or destroyed?" See, Jesus is basically saying, what are you prepared to lose here? And what are you hoping to gain? Do you want to gain the whole world? Because if you gain the whole world, you'll lose the things that are most important. But if you're willing to lay down lesser things for greater things, you'll find that those are the things that have real, lasting value. If you do everything self wants, you'll gain the whole world, but what did you give up along the way? What happens to our souls, the part of us that exists forever, when we do everything for self and leave God out of the equation entirely? Jesus is basically telling us to focus on the things that really matter. Focus on the things that really matter. Make sure that what you're seeking after actually has eternal value, not just short-term gain. Which is what brings us then all the way back around to Lent. Because giving up something for Lent is an act, a tangible act of dying to self. Because self doesn't like giving things up, right? Like self wants what it wants. It doesn't want to give anything up. It doesn't want to be denied anything. But when we say no to something for a season, it's a tangible practice of dying to self, right? Self wants all the sugar and caffeine it can get its hands on. But when you say no, you're dying to self. You're denying self what it wants. You're laying something self wants down so that you can choose greater things instead. Self wants to doom scroll on social media for hours and hours and hours. But when you say no for a few weeks, it starts to realign something in your spirit where you're dying to self so that you can say yes to God and reinvest that time in relationships with other people that really matter, or reinvest that time in your relationship with God, a relationship that really matters. Those are just a couple good ways to die to self so that we say no to self so that we can be more free to give God our yes. So, I have a few questions for us to reflect on, and then we'll wrap things up. But first off, what does it mean to you to daily pick up your cross? What does that mean to you? What does that look like for you to be in the practice of every single day? I'm going to pick up my cross, to die to self and follow Jesus. Second, where have you experienced gaining by losing in life? Where have you experienced where you've laid something down intentionally for a season, or maybe unintentionally for a season, and the result is that your faith has deepened, your relationships grew stronger, like you found more than what you laid down? And finally, what can you give up for Lent? I know you may view that as more of a Catholic or Lutheran thing, but it's not too late. I know Lent started like 9 days ago or 10 days ago, something like that, but it's not too late to lay something down. Because something that's beautiful about Lent is it's this season of increased intentionality where we lay something down. We lay something down. It's a tangible act of dying to self. But I think what you'll find is that when you lay something down for Lent, you will gain far more than what you lost. And it may be some one-on-one, like if you give up sugar, that's probably going to have some added health benefits, right? But there's also spiritual benefit just simply to the act of laying something down for a season. So for the next few weeks, we're going to look at areas of our lives where we can give something up, where we can intentionally lay something down for a season. So some examples we'll be looking at over the next few weeks. We're going to look at fasting and the power that fasting can have in our lives, where we lay down eating for a meal, for a couple meals, even for an extended period of time, and the benefits that can have. We're going to look at technology and setting limits with our screens and all our devices. We're going to look at noise and busyness and choosing instead to create space for silence and solitude and rest. But it all starts with an understanding of dying to self. It all starts with a desire to draw close to Christ by giving something up now so that we can reap the benefits later. Let's pray. Father God, this idea of dying to self can be a very uncomfortable one. It's not something that comes easily or comes naturally to any of us. Again, it's something that the self fights against vehemently. Lord, it may even be something that feels unwise. And yet, there you are with the call to pick up our cross every single day and follow you. Why? Because there is a deeper joy found in giving something up. There is a deeper sense of peace that can come when we choose to die to self. Lord, there's something that beautiful that happens when we lay something down, something that maybe even is good, but we lay it down so that we can focus on you more clearly. And Lord, I truly believe that when we give something up for your sake, we will gain far more than we lost. And so, Lord, challenge and encourage each of us in what we can lay down. Yes, Lent started some time ago, but it's not too late to lay something down so we can more fully worship and serve you. God, we love you. We worship you. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen.